This is an Elna 9000 computer sewing machine, an absolute top of the line model from 1989. I happened to find this one on the side of the road. It also came with an instruction manual, a workbook, and a huge selection of presser feet and accessories. I plugged it in and it all fired up. But not all is well. You can see here that it looks like it's sewing okay, but it's either not forming the threads or leaving huge loops. I didn't catch it on camera, but it was also breaking some needles when it would crash into the side of the presser foot. These are some pieces of fabric that were in with the accessories, so you can see it made amazing stitches when it all worked properly. I went to Spotlight and grabbed some sewing machine oil, some new cotton, a few bobbins, and a stack of fat quarters to play around with. Let's get inside. There are two screws holding the bottom shell on, which has to be removed first. All of the factory screws on the machine are number 2 posi drive. I don't have a thin enough posi drive screwdriver, so I'm using a Phillips and being careful to apply plenty of pressure while screwing or unscrewing. Unclip the needle plate and remove the presser foot and needle. Next, remove the 5 screws on the rear of the case. If you still have the little covers, they can be gently levered off with a small flathead screwdriver. The rear shell then comes off by rotating it around the power switch. Still at the rear of the machine, remove these 3 screws which hold the front on. Put the take-up lever in its highest position, lift the presser foot and remove the cover for the expansion cards. If you have the base plate removed, the shell should rotate off easily, but if you don't, you'll need to gently pry it over the bobbin winder. The service manual gives a fairly detailed description of how to remove the shells, but it just says, remove the head block, which is not very helpful. First, remove the automatic buttonhole connector, then the stepper motor connector. You'll need to unclip the little white protector on the stepper motor connector or it won't fit. And feed the wires to the rear of the machine. And you'll still need to use something to rotate it through the small hole. Remove the Captain tape and loosen the strain relief screw to release the wires. Rotate the machine to access the wire clamp and remove it and the screw. Remove the 2 lower screws on the threaded rod. The machine side has a nut and washer, the other side just threads into the body. Remove the 2 nuts and washers from the top of the head block. Gently tilt and pull the head block out whilst rotating the machine to allow the cranks to clear each other. Then gently pull the head block away from the cranks. There's a short shaft on the upper hook and a shaft on the needle bar, both of which slide out at the same time. The one on the needle bar is on an angle which can make this a little fiddly. Once the head block is out, remove the upper hook if it didn't come with it, and make sure you account for the small pieces. A thin washer between the long spring on the head block and the upper hook crank, and a small washer on the plastic crank. The first job is to adjust the needle swing motor. First connect the stepper motor wire back to the control board. Hold X and memory whilst turning the machine on to enter the test program, and press 2 to enter the needle swing test. The stepper motor will find its edge and then return to the centre. Push the stitch width minus button until it reaches its 12th negative step. It uses funny symbols for anything above 9. The motor should make a full step for the 12th, and then less than half a step for the 13th step, and hit the cam. The display will show -B. If it doesn't, loosen the 3 screws on the stepper motor so you can just turn the motor by hand and turn it until it's in spec. Tightening the screws can throw it out, so after you're done, press 2 again to recenter it, and then go back across and double check that it's stopping at the correct place. Also, there's a little bit of sin here with this replacement fastener. When you pull something like this apart, just get an ice cube tray or 2 and put the screws and small parts in it as you go. While everything's apart, it's a good time to give it a really good lubrication. Anything that's metal to metal gets sewing machine oil. And anything that's metal to plastic or plastic to plastic gets silicone grease. A Q-tip's a great tool for getting into hard to reach places. And don't go overboard. You don't want grease or oil on your thread or fabric. To put the head block back in, tie a generous length of thread around the outside bolt and pass the other end through the appropriate hole. Put the upper hook crank onto the head block. Don't forget the washers. Feed the wires through the hole at the back of the body and then offer up the head block to the machine. This is quite awkward, so I'm sorry I didn't get a great shot. Same as the removal, you're trying to get the upper hook shaft and the needle bar shaft on at the same time. A finger on the needle lock screw can lift and rotate it around to the correct place. Honestly though, a friend to help here would be great. Once you've got it hanging, slide the machine side bolt onto the shaft and rotate the crank away from you to get it into place. Then, using your thread for one side and a screwdriver or a finger on the other side, align the bolts with the holes and slide them home. The thread can just unwind off the bolt. Make sure the wires go on the inside of the threaded rod. Then install all 4 screws and bolts finger tight before tightening them properly. Reroute the cables back the way they came. Replace the cable clamps. Clean off the residue. Put on some fresh Captain tape and plug everything back in. Next I want to align the presser foot. First replace the regular foot on the machine and put it down on the bare dogs. Loosen the 2.5mm Allen bolt to the left of the presser bar. Shift the foot around until it lines up evenly with the feed dogs, and that there's 0.5 to 0.8mm of clearance between the guide and the lever. Then, retighten the screw. This can cause it to move, so double check everything after it's tightened. Now we can align the needle plate. Install the main plate and screws so it can just move. Then install the needle plate and a number 80 needle. Shift the main plate around so that it's equally spaced horizontally from the feed dogs, and so the needle is slightly forward of centre in the cutout. Carefully remove the needle plate and tighten the screws, checking with the needle plate as you go that the main plate hasn't moved. Now that the needle's centred forward and backwards, we need to centre it horizontally. You can see how it touches the edge of the needle plate when it's all the way to the left at the moment. Enter the test program and centre the needle. Then, with a flathead screwdriver, hold the cam steady and loosen the 2.5mm Allen screw to move the needle right, or tighten it to move it left. Once it's centred, use the stitch width controls to make sure it clears the plate on both sides. The foot pedal cable had some damage, so I pulled it apart with the intention of replacing the cable, which is just a 3.5mm jack 3-core audio cable. It had a bunch of hot glue covering up all of the connections though, which I didn't feel like digging out. And only the outer sheath was broken, so I put some electrical tape on it. Gave the pedal a good clean and lube, which made a huge difference to the feel, and put it back together. Just be careful with the screws as they all go into plastic. The drive belt seemed to be running a little close to the edge of the pulley. To set the tension, first loosen both screws on the motor.
Oh my god. Tight as anything.
Then the belt should run slightly away from the drive pulley. Tighten one screw, and then with the motor running, pivot the motor until the belt runs in the middle of the pulleys. Now we'll check the motor speed. Enter the test program and push 5. Push the foot pedal down completely and the machine should run at between 860 and 900 RPM. If this is out of spec, you can adjust it with the top trim pot. Keeping the pedal pushed down, push 7 and it should run between 90 and 110 revs. If not, adjust it with the bottom trim pot. If you have to adjust this one, then you need to start the whole test again as it can affect the high speed setting. Still keeping the pedal pushed down, press 8. The machine should run at about 780 revs. Press it again and it should run at about 530. Let off on the pedal until it runs at about 150 RPM. The second light on the band of 5 should be off when the RPMs are under 130 and on when it's over 150. If not, adjust with the middle trim pot. The bobbin winder wasn't engaging when I pushed the button. This should lock. To remove the assembly, it's just the 2 visible screws and the connector to the PCB. The issue is this little spring-loaded bevel gear is getting stuck on the shaft and not moving down when the switch is pressed. I initially tried moving it up and down manually a few times whilst putting some silicone grease in from each end, but this only worked a couple of times and then froze up again, and I had to come back and fix it properly. Remove the 2 E-clips with a small screwdriver. Pull down on the gear whilst pulling up on the bobbin holder and use a needle to push out the pin in the shaft. The gear should slide freely on the shaft. It's a very light spring pushing on it, and you can see how sticky it is. This is almost exactly the same issue that I had on the jar opener, and we'll fix it in the same way. I progressively sanded the shaft with 1200 grit sandpaper, cleaning it off and checking it every so often until I got a nice sliding fit. Give it all a few big dobs of silicone grease, then insert the shaft in from the top, put the spring and gear on, and arrange the gear on the shaft so that you can see the hole. Poke the pin in as far as it'll go. Pull the gear down slightly and rotate it 90 degrees before pushing it back up onto the pin, otherwise it won't be able to disengage. Slide the shaft the rest of the way, install the lower E-clip and washer, and then, holding the spring down, install the other E-clip. Add a bit more grease if you think it needs it, and pop it back in the machine. The check spring is on the inside of the front case. The centre slot is the standard and mine was set 1 notch higher. Given all the work I'm doing, I figured I'd reset it. Slightly loosen the screw, put the spring where you want it and retighten. You really don't need to make this too tight. Once that's done, the front shell can go back on. Ensure the take-up lever is set to 0 and the presser foot's up. Again, gently lift it over the bobbin winder and slide it into place. You may need to slightly rotate the main crank to get it around to the upper hook. Make sure it's tight against the body and install the 3 screws. Install the rear shell by rotating it around the power switch and make sure that it's tight to the front shell before screwing it on. The longer 3 screws go here, here, and here. Make sure you get all the screws started before tightening any of them down. You can then snap the light into place. Sit the feed disengage switch in place, and with the machine on its side, install the lower shell using the holes in the base to install the 2 screws.
And if you had it off, don't be a moron. Remember to put the tension wheel back on before you assemble the entire machine, because now I've got to take all the shells back off.
The tension wheel can actually fit on in 2 ways. Make sure that the Allen screw is centered in the cutout. I only had it back together for a minute or so when the needle swing stopped working again. I pulled all the shells off again and found that the presser bar spring had gotten past the take-up lever, which was blocking the needle movement. I got it back underneath with a screwdriver, but it didn't seem right, so I took the whole thing apart again. And this is the problem. The inner part of the take-up lever is a plastic shaft and the edges of it have broken off, which means that the lever can't apply enough pressure and the spring's getting past the pad. Here's the view of what's happening from the rear of the head block. I reviewed the footage from the first time I had it apart, and it was already slightly broken then, so it looks like old age and wear just got the better of it. I removed the lever, cleaned the plastic with some alcohol, and mix up some epoxy to glue the bits back together. Right. I don't think it would have worked anyway. Let's pin it. Unfortunately the lever's hardened, so I'm annealing the end whilst holding the plastic cap in a jar of water so it doesn't melt. I've drilled a couple of 1.5mm holes on either side of the screw hole, and I've ground the head diameter of the screw slightly smaller. I've got it mounted back on the head block in the correct position. I'm hand drilling out each hole in the plastic with a pin vise to be a tight fit with a cut-off nail. Once they're in, I'm using some epoxy to glue the nails to the lever, but not the plastic. I still want to be able to remove this if I need to. It looks a bit hacky, but this works really, really well. Once it was back together, it felt super tight. Right, back on track. The service manual says to adjust the thread tension with a spring balance of 0 to 150 grams. I don't have one of those, so I jumped online. Couldn't find one, but they had 0 to 250 grams, which I figured would work well enough. But every single seller was out of stock on that weight. It felt like a conspiracy. Anyway, I do have a kitchen scale, which is accurate to the gram. The bobbin tension needs to be set to 30 to 40 grams, so I've got a rubber glove filled with flour. And the upper tension needs to be set to 130 to 145 grams, so this one's filled with water. You obviously don't have to use rubber gloves, you could use balloons or other rubber things. The manual says to use this thread. I have no idea what that is, and no one I asked, including my mum, my grandma, the lovely little old lady at the sewing shop, or Google did either. So I'm using this. It's 100% cotton, medium weight, good quality thread. Wind a bobbin and install it. Run it through the needle plate, up and over the upper hook, and over a smooth round shank, and tie it to your 30 to 40 gram weight. If it drops quickly or not at all, remove the bobbin, remove the rotary hook, and adjust the small screw. Tighten to add tension, loosen to remove it. Replace everything and try again. Obviously, if you have the spring balance, just adjust it until it hits the spec, but if you're doing it with weights, you want it to just fall. Once I get it right, you can see how it holds still, but once I get it moving with a light tap, it falls smoothly. The upper tension's done in the same way with the 130 to 140 gram weight. Thread the machine normally until you get to the upper hook, then put it over your shank. Set the tension adjuster to 5, put the presser foot down, and then screw the 2mm Allen key in and out until you get the right tension. If you need to loosen tension, you may need to lift the presser foot after each adjustment, as it can stick slightly if you don't release it. So with all of those fixes and adjustments, it sews a straight and a zigzag stitch very nicely. However, one last thing to adjust is the feed balance, which is the amount it feeds forwards compared to backwards. You can see with this overlocking stitch, the short square stitches should overlap. I can fix it with the fine adjust wheel, but it's nearly at the end of its travel. First set the fine adjust wheel so that the red marks line up. Then, using a 2.5mm Allen key, turn the screw a little at a time and sew 4 or 5 overlocking stitches until the short sections line up properly. This adjustment is fabric and thread dependent, so especially for decorative stitches, you should check that they're sewing correctly and use the fine adjust wheel each time you change it. The last thing I want to fix is this little thread cutter. It's meant to cut both threads with a gentle tug, but most of the time it does nothing or just frays one or both of them. Thankfully, it's a simple matter of unscrewing the cap, being careful not to lose the spring that jumps out, removing the cup, rotate the cutter to the next blade, and put it all back together. Now it cuts really nicely. I might have to try and find a replacement blade for the next time it goes blunt though. Now that everything's working as it should, the last thing to do is give the machine a good clean. I removed everything I could and then wiped it down with some warm soapy water, using a toothbrush to get into the tight areas before wiping dry with a microfiber towel. All of the parts I removed are washed in the sink. Given how old it is, it was surprisingly clean, aside from the foot pedal and the front cover, which was dusty and had this gross splatter on it. It's especially important to get this clean as it doubles as an extended work table for the machine. So, now that it's all shiny, bright and brand new, let's have a look at it. It really is an amazing machine. It's very solid and stitches very smoothly and accurately. It's got a lot of features, like a drop-in bobbin, automatic needle, up, down. Adjustable needle centering. Automatic buttonholing, albeit with this bulky attachment. And a fantastic basting mode, which only puts one stitch every 4 revolutions, which requires a host of custom hardware to disengage the needle bar on demand. It's got a huge selection of decorative stitches which can be expanded by these memory cards. This more than anything else appeals to me in ways which I just can't describe. And you can adjust a lot of them on the machine, mirroring them on 2 axes, stretching them, and programming sets. You can also set the machine to stop for you after sewing a certain number of motifs. It does, however, have some issues that might have annoyed me if I'd paid nearly $2,500 for it in 1989. Although this lady seems happy. The little cutter we fixed is advertised as conveniently keeping the threads out of the way, except it holds the bobbin thread taut between the needle plate and the foot, so you can't put fabric underneath it easily. The needle swing motor centres once the machine goes through its startup procedure, but for some reason the feed motor only centres once you lower the needle for the first time. It's minor, but kind of annoying. I don't like that you can't access the accessories case while it's attached to the machine. Even most cheap models open from the front while they're still on. And I hate how tight the expansion card cover is. It feels like I'm going to snap it whenever you take it off or put it on. I'm also not a huge fan of the snap-on feet, as you're basically locked into Elna or whatever third-party manufacturers have copied. Thankfully, I got a huge range of feet with the machine, but I would like a daisy foot, and I haven't been able to find one that's compatible. Well, I've teased long enough, so I suppose I better make something. A cushion should do. I'm not a seamster by any means, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. This fabric frays a bit, so I'll overlock it, and then put in a hem. I'll use the memory feature to program in a few words as a bit of a highlight. I've marked the line with a sewing pen to follow with the foot, and I've ironed on some interfacing on the backside. With the 2 sides of the cushion together, I'll sew the ends that will meet with the zipper. Then I'll use that magnificent basting stitch to sew the rest of the seam for easy removal later. With the zip pinned in place, I'll sew one side of it with a zipper foot. Then offset the needle the other way and sew the other side. Then I'll seam around the rest of the cushion. and run out of bobbin thread. Isn't that how you know that it's properly broken in?
Ran out of bobbin.
And here it is. Yep, it's a Harry Potter cushion. Hopefully some fans will know what it says on the back. Unfortunately, the italic font came out a little blurred, I guess, is the word. I also sewed the seam on the wrong side of the hemline, so the stitching is visible. I might go back and fix it, but I probably won't. Hey, at least the zipper came out alright. Overall, I'm unbelievably happy with this find. Whilst I was a little surprised initially, after fixing it I can actually understand why someone might have thrown it away, as it had a lot of issues that would have been very expensive for a professional to repair. But now that it's working properly, I'm pretty sure it'll be my forever machine. I know this has been a much longer video than usual, and if you made it this far I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or you just want to share your own experience with these amazing machines, please let me know in the comments. Anyway,